Welcome, gentle listener. I am Voldemort, and I wish to introduce you to the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future. I felt that some of the most important recent events are worth looking into, and thus I'm beginning a run of entries of what I hope will be clear and simple presentations of some of those exciting events. Thus, all of the work herein contained will be purely that of Games Workshop that I am sharing to raise awareness in their events. These entries will not be visually accompanied, as I intend them for listening purposes only, saving more of the visual theatrics for my own work or pieces where I am not just presenting the work of GW. Background pieces to aid you through the building, fixing or painting of the hobby, or possibly as a bedtime story that requires little to no direct concentration as a relaxant only. I intend to cover the scenarios and works that are most important, yet may not have been given the attention I feel they deserve, starting with Vigilus Defiant, and then going on to Angel's Blade, but potentially moving into other entries if the demand is there. So, we begin with the seminal module Vigilus Defiant, the first campaign book of the 8th edition of Warhammer 40,000. Let's have at it. I hope you enjoy. To quote, Warhammer 40,000, Imperium Nihilus, Vigilus Defiant. A new kind of battleground. In the period that led up to the War for Vigilus, the planet was poised on the edge of destiny. Its proximity to the Eye of Terror had long put it on a war footing, but with the dawn of the Cicatrix Maledictum, Vigilus became incalculable in value to the Imperium, an tempting target for Xenos and Chaos invaders alike. The planet Vigilus was always famed as a linchpin of the Segmentum Obscurus. When the Great Rift opened, its status escalated from important to indispensable. So vital was Vigilus to the Imperium that when a teeming war of orcs burst from the Great Rift, the system's defenders responded with terrific force. The Astra Militarum and Adeptus sororitas stationed there contained the orc invasion and kept it from wrecking the densely populated hive sprawls, while several Space Marine chapters sent reinforcements from the Stygius sector and beyond. The latter waves were led by none other than Marneus Augustus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, and with him some of the finest minds in the Adeptus Astartes. These counter-assaults pulled Vigilus back from the brink. The psychic apocalypse of the Great Rift had disabled the planet's defenses and made it vulnerable, allowing the orcs to raid from the wastelands, barging through each defense perimeter to wage war in the city sprawls. In conjunction, a great uprising of gene-stealer cults was triggered, revealing an infestation that had festered upon Vigilus for hundreds of years. As the races of the galaxy desperately tried to prosper in the horror-filled reality of the Imperium Nihilus, millions of eyes turned towards Vigilus. Were it to fall, so would the hopes of all trapped in the Dark Imperium. With the Cadian Gate broken to the west and Warstone Sidious raging to the east, Vigilus was wide open to invasion by the forces of chaos. At the threshold of damnation. With the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum and the passing of the Noctis Eterna, Vigilus found itself in that dark region of space known as the Imperium Nihilus, upon the threshold of the Nachmund Gauntlet. As one of the two relatively stable paths between the half of the Imperium that contained Holy Terror, known as the Imperium Sanctus, and the far-flung Imperium Nihilus on the other side of the Great Rift, the Nachmund Gauntlet was of immense value to mankind. It allowed the Imperium to continue the movement of its forces across the interstellar gulf of the Great Rift, and also to maintain a line of astropathic communication, albeit an unstable and dangerous one, with the world stranded in the Dark Imperium. Should the Imperium ever truly be divided, it would likely fall apart entirely. Hence the importance of Vigilus. It acted as a vital beachhead that kept the Imperium Nihilus under a semblance of Holy Terror's control. None truly know how or why the Great Rift formed, but the fight to gain passage across it quickly became intense. Vigilus had always boasted a vast amount of manpower, and had inherited a great number of Imperial Guard regiments since the clearing of the Cadian Gate, an event the Ministorum referred to as the pre-Tempestine Exodus. But it soon became evident that the threats facing the planet would test its defenders to their limit. The planet was traditionally ruled over by a loose confederation of elders and nobles called the Aquilarian Council, known to the Adeptus Mechanicus as the Council of Cogs. The fact that the different delegates could not even agree on a name demonstrates how divided they were. The palatial areas of Saints Haven were riven by political wars for decades. Only the spectre of complete annihilation saw Vigilus united. War on all fronts. The fate of this distant world is worth 1,000 others. If it falls, if the Nachmund Gauntlet collapses, the Imperium Nihilus is all but lost to us. The Empire of Terror will soon follow. Tigurius, Chief Librarian of the Ultramarines. At boiling point, Reboot Gilliman himself designated Vigilus invaluable. The planet was something between a sentinel bastion and a staging post for further conquest, and its many Astra Militarum regiments and Adeptus Mechanicus macroclades formed a second line of defense against chaos incursions from outside the Cadian Gate. At the onset of the Xenos invasion, Vigilus's vast and contiguous landmasses were broken only by a series of fortified reservoirs. The Dust Bowl wastelands between each city sprawl were analogous to the oceans, and just as difficult to cross. They were not only arid and barren, but also hydrophagic. In places, the chemical composition of their dust dunes was so saline it could desiccate bare flesh in a matter of hours. In theory, simply wearing enough protective clothing could have assuaged this. Unfortunately, the dust storms and twisters that were spun out from the giant tempest in the east, known as the Vrulian Swirl, caused this desiccant to creep into every chink of a traveller's armour. The dunes were hence populated only by tough-skinned or shell-armoured predators that preyed upon the unwary. The planet's rare areas of productive land were highly sought after, but rampant industrialization saw most of them develop into urban metropoli called high sprawls. These were so large they formed entire continents. The world was formerly ruled by its planetary governor, Lucian Agamemnus IX. That dynasty had overseen the planet's affairs from the spirals of the capital, Saints Haven, for millennia, yet the planet was famous for being a stronghold of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Vigilus's relative proximity to Warzone Stygius saw it serve as a way station for incoming Imperial forces, including the Space Wolves and various Skitarii legions. Its placement in the cosmos alone made it a valuable asset, but its exports too were vital for the Imperial war machine. Vigilus was once amongst 100 Imperial worlds in the Segmentum Obscurus, considered important primarily for the war material and manpower it exported. The planet's principal export was its exceptional defensive technologies. The Adeptus Mechanicus of Vigilus were blessed with the standard template construct for Psych-Tech force fields, and were sanctioned by Mars to put them into production. As well as being shipped out to aid the defences of countless other worlds, these Bastion-class force fields were installed around the perimeter of every vigilant continent as part of a treaty that had been agreed with the Tech Priests and the Agamemnus dynasty. Until the opening of the Great Rift and the Xenos invasions that followed, these defences kept the planet's industries and populace safe from outside invasion. In exchange, the Adeptus Mechanicus were largely left to their own devices on the forged continent of Borealis, one of the false continent cityscapes that covered Vigilus's crust, but as time went on this proved a high price. Much of Borealis was given over to the unearthing of a strange black mineral that ran like veins through its crust, which the Tech Priests obtained through vast and destructive mining operations. For the most part, these excavations were powered by energy produced in the volatile volcanic region of Stormval to the south. The deep drilling of the Adeptus Mechanicus bore hives caused such violent earthquakes across the planet that many a hive was toppled, many a ruler statue cast down, and the water table disrupted to the point that potable water became extremely scarce. Still, the machine cults of Stygius VIII delved ever deeper in their search to unravel the mysteries of the universe, no matter their provenance or cost. Meanwhile, the gradual but undeniable influence of the Ministorum was to see the Agamemnus dynasty slowly infiltrated by agents of the ecclesiarchy. None could gainsay their encroachment, for to challenge them was to challenge faith in the Emperor himself. The Ministorum priests installed amongst the local Vigilant Guard worked ceaselessly to indoctrinate their Astra Militarum charges until they too became dogmatic soldiers of faith. As the decades slipped by, the inner districts of Hyperia High Sprawl, Vigilus' capital continent, echoed to the march of ever more Adeptus sororitas and their pious Vigilant Guard allies, until some said the planetary governor was ruler in name only. Vigilus was becoming host to several distinct power bases, all determined to pursue their own agenda no matter the cost. The planet's disparate continents came into conflict over resource monopolies many times, but outright war was always avoided due to the effort of the Aquilarian Council. Unfortunately, as resources were sequestered in ever more blatant power grabs, the grievances of the Aquilarian Council escalated from bickering and infighting to saber-rattling and threats of violence that saw the planet brought to the brink of deadly civil war. Then, under the malignant light of the Great Rift that broke across the galaxy, Vigilus and the other planets orbiting the star Astra Vigilia entered a new phase of their tempestuous existence. The waters of Vigilus. Water was scarce on Vigilus, for the planet had a very low water table, and aside from the wide-scale recycle operations, there were few ways to replenish used stores. In addition, planet growth and arable farming were a rarity. The planet's food production came from various inventive sources, amongst them cactus farms, vermin abattoirs, and subterranean nutrivats. These latter methods recycled the fat-rich runoff and nutrient-rich sweat that dripped from the grates of the planet's grossly overpopulated manufactorum hubs. On Vigilus, the kind of water a person drank was a powerful status symbol, indicative of their wealth and position. The majority of people in the upper class and working populations drank water from deep underground, known as aqua subterra. This was dirty, foul-tasting and yellowish, but affordable. The rich and powerful drank aqua glacius, mined in vast cuboid icebergs on the polar continent of Calyx Bane. The faithful flock of the Ministorum in Hyperia Hiva Sprawl drank recycled water purified with holy oils, aqua sanctus, whereas the Adeptus Mechanicus drank aqua meteoris, mined from frozen asteroids they harnessed with the greater Omniscion hoist. Chronology of a Dark Age. The chronology of Vigilus, as denoted in records of the War of Beasts, uses as its anchor point the opening of the Great Rift above the planet. This was an event of such incredible magnitude it rewired the planet's temporal logic altogether, much as it did 1,000 other war zones across the Imperium. The first element of Vigilus' timestamp is the annual designator. It starts with the number of years either before or after the rift opened, and then a number of chronosegments within that year as the second element. Imperial days are broken down into chronosegments of 8 hours. After this is a third element, either previo, if the events occurred before the opening of the Great Rift, or post, if after it. This third element is sometimes denoted as a minus sign or a plus sign. The fourth element of the Vigilus timestamp is the system's designator initials, in essence, the initials of the system to which it refers. For Vigilus, this is VCM, which stands for Vigilus Cicatrix Maledictum. For its neighbouring planet, Omnis Prion, the designator initials would be OPCM. By way of a full example, if the time of an event in the Vigilus system was 3 days, 9 chronosegments before the opening of the Great Rift, the timestamp will be 0.9 previo VCM.M41. This translates to 0 years and 9 segments, 3 days, previous to the Vigilus system's first instance of the Cicatrix Maledictum in the 41st millennium. If it was 1 year and 8 hours after, the timestamp would be 1.1 post VCM.M41, also expressed as 1.1 post, or 1.1 plus. The Great Rift yawns wide. Before the onset of the conflict known as the War of Beasts, Vigilus witnessed a cataclysm so great it all but split the galaxy in half. The Cicatrix Maledictum ripped from the Eye of Terror in the galactic northwest to the Hadex anomaly in the southeast. Aside from a few corridors, the rift was all but impossible. When the skies split around Vigilus, many feared the planet would be consumed forever. Instead, As the swirling nebula dissipated, it seemed that Vigilus had held the Cicatrix Maledictum at bay. The planet's strange aegis linked it with the night world of Darovar and the distant planet of Sangua Terra to form the corridor known as the Nachmund Gauntlet. Whether it was faith, the Emperor's will, a fluke of quantum entanglement, or some other phenomenon that kept this rift passage open, none knew. But the route from the reaches of the still functional Imperium to the desperate realms of the Imperium Nihilus remained stable. Vigilus became more vital than ever, and not only to the Imperium. Traitor generals and Xenos masterminds looked upon it with covetous eyes, and hatched secret plans to conquer it. Drukhari raiders struck from the Arctic Webway portal on KLX Bane, whilst Craftworld Samhan sent emissaries to warn of a doom to come. A dark new era dawned across Vigilus's desert wastes and other populated hives. With the sky rent in twain by a warp rift that bled purple light into the heavens, and civil unrest reached new heights, draconian laws were put into place by the planet's governing bodies. It was forbidden to look at the night sky. On those rare occasions it could be glimpsed through the thick banks of cloud that choked the stratosphere, and a strict curfew was imposed that ensured all citizens would be indoors by nightfall, or flogged for a full hour. The repression that resulted saw many civilians look to new cults and underground orders for succor. Ironically, it was this heavy-handed lawmaking that sowed the seeds of anarchy. With the warp rift of the Cicatrix Maledictum scarring the Vigilus sky, the doom that many had feared would consume the planet from outside instead began to take its toll from within. To one extent or another, every citizen of Vigilus found themselves harrowed by dark dreams and recurring nightmares. The sleep-deprived and foul tempers that resulted spilled over into 100 new conflicts every day, from small skirmishes and beatings in alleyways to industrial strikes, organized uprisings and spates of assassinations that scoured the upper spires. To run the gauntlet. The Nachmund Gauntlet ran from Vigilus to the planet of Sangua Terra in the Imperium Sanctus. Near the northern end of the warp corridor was the world of Darovar, the stronghold of an ancient dynasty of imperial knights ruled over by King Caligius. Once considered cautious, the king's behavior had become ever more paranoid and erratic, and it was said he protected his holdings with the ferocity of an enraged drake. His defenders claimed he was like that with good reason, for on either side of the Nachmund Gauntlet was a seething tide of chaos that constantly sought to break its metaphysical bonds and spill into real space. At the dawn of the Great Rift, ships that sought safe passage through the Gauntlet had no choice other than to pass near Darovar. Those who gave the planet a wide berth were allowed to slink past without interception. Those who sought safe haven or attempted to contact the night world under a flag of parley were treated with hostility, suspicion, or even violence. A staunch independent, Caligius was already convinced that no good would come from allowing the Imperium to draw him back into the fold. Instead, he turned to tyranny and oppression. Even as the term Imperium Nihilus was coined, he was declared excommunicate traitoris. The Speed War. The Orc invasion of Vigilus was sudden, and its scale caught the Imperial defenders off guard. At first it was contained, though it brought to light threats that had lingered unseen for years. At the end of the 41st millennium, the tensions upon Vigilus had risen sky high, what with the Adeptus Mechanicus triggering ever more frequent earthquakes, and the power struggle between the planetary governor's dynasty and the Ministerium developed into covert violence. Then the Great Grift, a new celestial phenomenon appearing like a slowly opening wound in the sky, spat out a hurtling fleet of ramshackle Orc spacecraft into the Vigilus system. With the rift scrambling the foresight of the planet's sanctioned seers and prophets, there was little warning of the Orc invasion's approach. The fleet punched through Vigilus's naval cordon with sudden, overwhelming force, then crash-landed its ships in the great deserts between the high sprawls. Those that survived, protected from destruction by bubble-like force fields, formed ready-made fortresses, which became the heart of the scrap cities from which the Orcs would attack the high sprawls. What they lacked in organization and structural integrity, they made up for in sheer mass and firepower. For days, the wastelands echoed to the hammering of metal, the thudding of rivet guns, the guttural commands of Orc mechanics, and the throaty roar of smoke-spewing engines. Vehicle by vehicle, Then swarm by swarm, 100 mechanized invasion forces emerged at great pace from the dust bowls. The speed war had begun, and at their head rode Speed Lord Supreme, Cruel Ducker. The Orcs were stymied at first by the Bastion-class force fields that surrounded each high sprawl. The invaders were forced to content themselves with raiding the convoys and armoured regiments that braved the wastelands and deserts, either to escort dignitaries or move material from one continent to another. Some Orcs took to racing one another around the planet, even skirting the edge of the vast dust storms known as the Vulian Swirl. When the Great Rift grew to split the galaxy entire and the Noctis Eterna dawned, the baleful emanations of the Rift's warp storms washed across Vigilus. The eddies of psychic disruption caused a plague of nightmares to intensify in the populace, but worse still, collapsed all of the psi-tech force fields that kept the Orcs from Vigilus's cities. If the Orcs had been a rational, right-thinking race, it may have taken them days to capitalize upon the lack of force fields, but with their speed-freak outriders constantly daring one another to run through the perilous energies, or at least get as close as possible, it was less than an hour before word spread that the defences were down. When the Orcs got wise to this, they wasted no time, and poured into the outskirts of each city in tremendous numbers. The Adeptus Mechanicus, Astra Militarum, and Adeptus Sororitas that defended the high sprawl borders found themselves engaged on all fronts, and within days they were fighting desperately to slow the Orcs' momentum. Even the biodome sprawl of Mortwald, protected by a network of traditional trenches and bunkers as well as force fields, suffered invasion. As the Orc attack intensified, Mortwald's succulent forests and rejuvenant complexes were ransacked in several districts. The rise of the Pauper Princes. The seeding of the gene-stealer cult of Vigilus began long ago, in silence and in darkness. With the first successful invasions of the Orcs, the cult burst forth in a tremendous eruption, its members falling upon not only the citizens they had planned to usurp, but the invaders they sought to deny the cult its prize. In the vigilant year 210.33 Previo, a cult of pure-strain gene-stealers was sent out from the planet of Chance's Vale by the gene-stealer cult known as the Pauper Princes. Only one managed to make it to Vigilus, but one was enough. Secreting itself in the seismic caverns beneath Mega Borealis, it began to spread its insidious creed across the planet. Over the ensuing years, it grew larger and more powerful as it became the dominant father of brood cycle after brood cycle, and ultimately the patriarch known as Grandsire Worm. Centuries later, when the Greenskins descended upon Vigilus, they triggered, albeit unwittingly, a premature uprising of the gene-stealer cultists who had long been hidden amongst the populace. Just as possessive of the planet as were its imperial authorities, and a great deal less divided, they refused to see their long years of subterfuge and infiltration wasted amidst the anarchy of the Orc onslaught. They staged insurrections within every hive sprawl on Vigilus, and thanks to the psychic coordination of Grandsire Worm and his Nexus strategists, they rose with eerie synchronicity to enact ambushes and cunning strategies across the planet. Nowhere was this more evident than in Dirkton High Sprawl. Dirkton was under-resourced and underdeveloped. Here the Pauper Princes had gained such a foothold that in some sub-districts their faithful outnumbered the non-believers. Moreover, the cult had infested the ranks of Dirkton's defense regiments, the Vigilant Guard, like gutworm riddles the innards of a dying ore miner. Acting upon secrets pried from the minds of compromised tech magi, the cult leaders gained access to alpha-level data SARMs and scriptural mnemonics that enabled them to temporarily shut down Dirkton's Bastion force fields. The shields had wreathed Vigilus's hive spores for centuries. Had such a failure occurred during more normal times, it would have been immediate cause for suspicion and investigation. However, with the baleful influence of the Great Rift playing havoc with the Adeptus Mechanicus' shield technologies, it was a simple matter for cult-corrupted officers of the Vigilant Guard to convince their fellows that the shutdown was caused by a technical glitch. Panic ensued, just as the cultists had known it would. The Orcs of the Speed War were quick to respond to Dirkton's weakness, and dust trails choked the horizon as the Xenos invaders grew near. It was those same cultist agents who contrived to order elements of the vigilant 86th, 94th, and 313th out into the dusty wastes beyond the shield line. Each platoon was hand-picked for the duty of defending the high sprawl, their officers given stern assurances that they would be drawn back within the walls as soon as the Tech Magi had placated the truculent machine spirits. Some 4,000 soldiers marched into the waste from Glaive Point to the Rascalid underworks. They faced an onrushing horde of over 15,000 orcs, but took solace in the knowledge that they would only have to hold until the shields were reactivated. It was then that the cult's undercover agents in Dirkton staged their uprising. Outnumbering the remaining loyalists 10-1, they seized control of the Sprawl's military assets. Then, as their dismayed former comrades realized the scale of their betrayal, the Pauper princes raised the force field again, stranding Dirkton's vigilant guard on the wrong side of it. The orcs fell upon their horrified victims, who had no line of retreat. The slaughter was brief and horrific. Not all of those remaining within the sprawl were xeno-corrupted, sensing their peril even if they did not fully understand it. Thousands of industrial labourers, dust miners and menials gathered their families and meagre possessions before fleeing over the Hyperia Dirkton fort wall. But this too worked in the Pauper prince's favour. Swathing themselves in rags or donning the workers' coveralls, hundreds of cultists mingled into the refugee tide. Thus was their curse carried to the southern reaches of Hyperia. At Otek High Sprawl too, the Pauper princes struck hard. If Dirkton had been chosen for its comparative weakness, Otek was selected instead for its strategic importance. Its vast reservoirs, known locally as the Hollows, were one of Vigilus's primary water sources. On such a dry and barren world, this made each reservoir as valuable as a lake of liquid adamantium. The battle to control Otek was far more bitter than that in Dirkton. Still, thanks to their frightening levels of preparedness and their utter fanaticism, the Pauper princes were able to seize control of Gregan Hollow and start corrupting the drinking water of billions with their insidious genetic taint. Hidden agendas. Selfish souls. The Aquilarian Council had watched picked thief relays of the orcs being hurled back by their Psytech force fields with a sense of confident superiority. Now they received reports of a new force rising. To their consternation, the messages told of a threat coming from within rather than without. The scattered missives detailing subterranean uprisings were at first attributed to malcontents, criminals, and opportunists. The prevailing opinion was that the perpetrators would soon be put down by the local Adeptus Arbates, or failing that, the companies of Astra Militarum dispatched to destroy such rebellions before they could gain too much ground. These forces of law and righteous oppression were sent to deal with uprisings and demagoguery wherever they were reported. Then the Hyperion leaders and their ilk went back to focusing on how best to capitalize on the industry of war. The after-action reports that made it back from those violent oppressions revealed signs of something far worse than mere civil unrest. Strange sigils had been spotted on many walls and archways, depicting a curled and spined creature that some called a worm form. There were rumours of sinister four-armed creatures scuttling in the darkness, and the word Xenos was being whispered more and more amongst the common folk. It was enough to cause those who had held power to shore up their defences. It was their instinct to look to their own safety above all other concerns. The Ministerium ensured those armed forces over whom they held the most sway, the resident orders of the Adeptus Sororitas and the ever-faithful Vigilant Guard, stayed close at hand within Saints Haven, even though the nearest Xenos sighting was some hundreds of miles away. The Adeptus Mechanicus withdrew many of its glacier claimants and aqua prospectors from Calyx Bane, though a skeleton crew remained to quarry for water. As the industry of Vigilus broke down, the frequency of the convoys that were crossing the wastelands on export missions or trade delegations slowed to a crawl. To make matters worse, the speed freaks that used those desolate reaches as their hunting grounds were merciless. The leadership of Vigilus launched tentative counterattacks, but prioritized their own safety, putting aside alliances and pacts in favor of self-preservation. The scar in the night sky. Though the worlds of the Vigilus system had not been entirely cut off from the rest of the Imperium, it became ever more obvious that a new and darker phase of existence had dawned. The Great Rift was visible only as a purple blur during the daylight, but at night the immensity of the Cicatrix Maledictum glowed across the sky. Its curling extremities and swollen central mass seemed to form screaming mouths and deformed faces when glanced at out of the corner of the eye. It stole sleep and distorted rational thought, even affecting the chronoslates and data webs of the Adeptus Mechanicus with its anarchic emanations. On Vigilus, the Great Rift became particularly prominent at night, and hence curfews were put in place across all of Vigilus's conurbations. In every hive spawn, it was forbidden to be outside after sunset, lest the Cicatrix maledictum take that person's attention for so long that they become infected by its strangeness and rendered susceptible to psychic phenomena. Even with these precautions, the shape of the Great Rift, a serpentine mass with the channel of the gauntlet across it, began to appear in the daubings of madmen and the idle scrawlings of those who thought themselves to be concentrating on something else. More disturbing still, it appeared in natural phenomena as well. After images of the rift manifested behind the eyes of those who had looked on it too long, but unlike those caused by strange natural light, they did not fade. Parents looked in horror as they found birthmarks on infants born directly under the night sky when the rift glowed bright, each red wheal broken in by a thin white line of unblemished skin. The mildew growths and water stains on the walls and ceilings of the hollows, water purification plants formed in shapes that were uncannily similar, if not identical, to the rift in the sky above. The purge squads of the ecclesiarchy operating out of Saints Haven tracked down such phenomena with cold efficiency and zealous verve. But soon, even they found themselves growing desperate, for as the years went by, these phenomena became more pronounced. Where the planet's earthquakes rent the land, chasms would fall open in shapes that echoed that of the Great Rift, complete with thin land bridges that corresponded to the position of the Nachmund Gauntlet. Doom from within. The Space Marines, to make landfall on Vigilus, were the Iron Hands and their successor chapter, the Brazen Claws. Their intent was to drive back the orcs assaulting the highest spores, but they soon found themselves fighting for their lives against an unexpected foe. The Iron Hands and their allies in Battle Group Gauntlet translated into the Vigilus system without interception. They had calculated their approach through the beleaguered star system of the Imperium Nihilus with great care. It is a testament to their mathematic skill and attention to detail that they arrived on target, despite the massive disruption of the Great Rift had caused to the star systems nearby. The vast mechanical cathedrals of the Iron Hands fleet plunged out of the warp nebula like red-hot javelins through a veil of cobwebs, bursting into real space in an eddying cloud of stardust. Within minutes of translation from the Imperium, they had targeting solutions for each of the Orc vessels that still hung in orbit between them and the planet. Those were few and far between, for the vast majority of Xenos had made haste planetside, leaving little behind to guard their rear. The Orcs had, in all likelihood, assumed their conquest would be over quickly, but the Bastion-class force fields had frustrated them. Now they were overcommitted and their prey had been able to summon reinforcements. It was an elementary mistake, and the chapter master of the Iron Hands, Cardon Stronos, resolved to make the Orcs pay dearly for it. The battle barges and strike cruisers of the Space Marine fleet quickly made orbit above each of the major hive spores, the Adeptus Astartes within filling the drop pod launch bays before hurtling through the atmosphere towards the battles below. Many more were to descend to the planet via Thunderhawk or Bulklander. They made for the most war-torn areas, usually around the fringes of each metropolitan zone, where the Orcs were attacking in force. But in many of these areas they encountered no Orc presence whatsoever, and in Mega Borealis they found themselves beset by a different breed of Xenos altogether. Since the uprising of the Pauper princes, the planet's defenders had found themselves fighting two wars. The Aquilarian Council had dispatched what resources it could spare from Hyperia, hoping to swiftly restore order within Mega Borealis, where a hive spire had been toppled by long-range fire and fallen across the force field border, making a bridge into the hive's interior for opportunist Orc attacks. Meanwhile, Adeptus Arbites and Adeptus Sororitas patrols that ventured into territory claimed by the Genestale cult were swiftly ambushed. Those in transport were stranded amongst a maze of tank traps and barbed wire choked with the corpses of those who had gone before. On 3 separate occasions, Astra Militarum armoured columns, bullying their way through the rubble of the streets with dozer blades and spade shovels, took alternative routes when the going got too tough. They toppled into sinkholes and hidden subterranean chasms as the ground gave way before their cumulative weight. Those that managed to survive the fall were hunted by the horrible, half-glimpsed mutants that haunted the lower levels. Refugee convoys made for zones as yet untouched by the Orc assault, thinking themselves safe. Much of Vigilus's air support was focusing on the movements of the green-skinned tribes and confining them where necessary with punitive strafing runs. The Orc speed freaks' formations were easily discerned, for they left long trails of dust in the wastelands. Many were heading straight for the landing sites of the Space Marine drop forces, where the fighting was fiercest. By avoiding these telltale trails, Imperial strike forces were able to evacuate high-level personnel from those areas of the city where law and order still reigned. However, the Gene Stealer presence was much harder to identify, and attempting to perform relief and evacuation operations in regions infested by the Xenos insurgents was akin to diving headfirst into a nest of vipers. In the space of a few days, the dual threat of Orc and Gene Stealer cult had torn apart the Vigilus command structure. Battle for the Seeping Delta. The mid-western fringe of the continent Borealis came under siege within hours of the force fields going down. Its westernmost point, known as the Seeping Delta, due to the rivers of industrial runoff that had burned across its reaches, became a killing ground. There were few built-up areas here, for the ground itself had been poisoned. Though the hyperacidic soil was of little consequence to the metal-legged Skitarii and tough-skinned orcs that fought over it, the quagmires and sudden subsidence meant that vehicles could swiftly get bogged down or vanish without trace, the death toll spiraling into the millions as both forces poured ever more infantry into the fight. With the pragmatism of one who has long forgotten notions such as honor, Fabricator Vosh of Borealis ordered the Seeping Delta set alight. Just as the Orcs mustered an overwhelming force against the city's defenders, 600 flamer-armed Cataphren breachers trundled into place and set the entire delta aflame. The Fabricator had ordered refined promethium to be funneled into the area, so the entire landmass was consumed in liquid flame, as if a match had been dropped into a petrochemical spill. The Orcs were consumed by the fire, turning into frailing, living torches in their tens of thousands. The Skitarii burned with them, all save the Ruststalkers equipped with anti-incendiary ablative armor for the subsequent clean-up operation. These specialist stilt-legged killers were tasked with running down any Orcs that survived and preventing their leaders from escaping into the city. It was a victory, but it was one at an insanely high cost. Defense of Borealis. The continent of Borealis was unlike any other on Vigilus. Punctured, wounded, torn up and left as a landscape of chasms, pits and sinkholes, its tumbled cities provided a million places to hide. Though the entire continent of Borealis felt the sting of war at times, during the early stages of the conflict, the fighting was thickest around Borealis. Situated to the south of that ravaged sprawl, the hive provided over half of the energy that kept Borealis's countless manufactorums running, for it had been built atop a massive thermal stack that yielded endless geothermic power. In many ways, it was the key to power in the sprawl. When the Orcs first attacked the planet Vigilus, the Lord of Hive Skelerus, the tech priest Dominus Impluvius XIV, spent over 8 nights with his internal cogitators running hot as he attempted to categorize the war in the wastelands. During this time, he also gazed in awe at the giant cosmic aberration that was appearing in the night sky, doing his level best to rationalize what was happening to his planet. Content that his holdings were well defended by the force field network on the ground, Impluvius XIV coordinated a flak net of Onaga dune crawlers to destroy the Orc aircraft that sought to hurtle over the defenses. Though the fringes of the false continent were being bombarded, and in places demolished, by the artillery of the Orc strongholds in the wastes, he contented himself that Borealis's key installations were safe. He went back to his studies of the Rift. When the backlash of the warp cataclysm bathed Vigilus in its strange energies, the disruption to the Bastion-class force fields network was quickly discovered by the roving Orc commandos probing the frontier for weak points. A terrible storm of dust and pollution was raised by the esoteric forces roiling across Borealis, and the Orcs were quick to capitalize. The speed freaks in the wastes scrambled for their camps and hurtled towards Borealis without a second thought, their headlong charge obscured by the tempest of pollution and dust that rolled across its borders. With speed and recklessness as their prime weapons, the Orcs made exceptional progress through the high spore, for the continent's defenders could not bring their big guns to bear in time. Bursting through the outskirts came smoke-belching swarms of Orc vehicles, so ramshackle and careless in their construction it sickened the faithful of the machine god just to look upon them. Across the refineries of Craxon, the slag fields and the south reaches of Grisport, they proved nigh impossible to stop. Upon realizing the full extent of their predicament, Imperius XIV froze, caught in a mental feedback loop that robbed his Skitarii and Cult Mechanicus troops of any directions other than squad-level leadership. Perhaps his cogitator mechanisms had been damaged by the Great Rift. Perhaps he had been a victim of some midnight hypnosis at the hands of an agent of the Pauper princes. Perhaps he was simply paralyzed by fear. Whatever the reason, his forces found themselves without orders and unsupported by the Imperial Knights that stood ready to defend the hive, and the god machines of the Legio Feroxus that languished dormant in Sceleris's war hangars. The continent's defenders fought the sudden Orc assault as best they could, but in 100 places and more they were overwhelmed. When the gene-stealer cults of Borealis rose up, their day of ascension triggered prematurely by the Orc invasion, High Sceleris's defences swiftly came apart. All the perfectly calculated kill zones and flak solutions put in place against invasion from without were rendered obsolete by the attack from within. The gene sector of the Writhing Worm, a subfaction of the Pauper princes under Slygax the Prophet, aimed to immediately orchestrate the most devastating assault they could. They had captured a vortex missile at great cost in lives, and now took that terrible payload deep into the High Spore's heart, using stolen access codes and torn-out eyeballs and severed fingers of slain authority figures to confound each hangar's biomantic checkpoints. The vortex missile was detonated beneath the slumbering warlord titan Dominus Rex. The megatonnage of its explosion was so potent it set off a string of detonations that destroyed not only the Rex, but also triggered a chain reaction that spread to all the knights alongside it. At a stroke, the most powerful assets in the entire continent were destroyed. Only when Archmagos Nessium Caldrake seized the malfunctioning Imperius XIV, had him placed in cryostorage, and took his place, did the Adeptus Mechanicus manage to put together something approaching a coordinated war effort. Caldrake proved a canny and decisive war leader, uniting his efforts with clan company Kargal of the Iron Hands, recently dispatched by Cardon Stronos to reinforce Borealis. He stopped the insurgencies of the Genestealer cultists from attaining critical momentum, forcing the war into a grinding stalemate where every city district and manufactorum was a site of bitter fighting. End quote. I have been Voldemort, your faithful servant. I hope you have enjoyed this first installment of Vigilus Defiant. If so, then please do consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications bell button, as I would not want you to miss out. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make time for fun. Toodaloo.